Sorry, I had children issue I needed to deal with to make sure they weren't
Going to take a few minutes today with a few notes before we turn it over to Amber. We're excited to have a lender perspective with us today as we talk PPP forgiveness. As the three of us talked in preparing this, for four of us actually talked in preparing this, the most important advice we have for everyone is, run your business. Take care of your business, yourselves, your employees, your customers. It's the most important thing you can do at this time. It's very easy to get caught up in everything Paycheck Protection Program and worry about minute details. But the most important thing you can do is continue your valiant efforts and work to keep your business successful. A few caveats as we go through this. Things continue to evolve. The SBA is, I believe, on their 13th or 14th interim final rule. In fact, I'll tell you that at 6:31 this morning, we received a new interim final rule from the SBA on PPP loan forgiveness. And we've reviewed that. We'll continue some of that here. There are still unanswered questions. Not all information is yet perfect, so we still have a few unanswered questions. There continues to be congressional action, court actions, Office of the Inspector General, and SBA and Treasury movement. There's talk that there may be at some point a simpler application for smaller loans. We don't know that for a fact. Right now, there's a single application for everybody. The strongest advice, and that's why we have a lender speaking today, is to work with your lender. And other best piece of advice is start early, gather your documentation. Take from this today, don't get completely hung up on the application form, but on the content and the rules and the types of things that can be forgiven. And I'll just repeat, run your business to the best of your ability and get help from all the resources that are available to you. So with that note, I'll turn it back to Amber and she'll take us through her presentation.
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to be here today. Thanks for having me. So we'll talk just a little bit about general forgiveness, and then Gina will step in to talk about some things, but this is just a general overview. Each lender will be responsible for their interpretation of what forgiveness is going to look like. We're all getting the same information from SBA, so I imagine that most banks and lenders are going to have similar process and they're going to interpret things similarly, but this is kind of general overview. So as probably most of us know, a minimum of 75% of your PPP loan should go towards eligible payroll or owner compensation replacement in order to be eligible for forgiveness. The remaining up to 25% should go to eligible expenses, and we'll talk a little bit more about what quantifies as a payroll expense and what's a general expense in some future slides. But it's going to be your rent or lease for contracts that were in effect prior to February 15th, 2020. So any of these expenses need to have been in place in contract by February 15th of this year. Same thing for utilities, and then interest on mortgages, and you can't prepay or pay off principal. It's just the interest portion only under this PPP. You also want to maintain your employee headcount or restore your employee headcount by June 30th. There's two different periods that you can use to determine what your headcount needs to be. That's either February 15th, 2019 through June 30th, 2019, or January 1st, 2020 through February 29th, 2020. So you can choose either of those periods, and you want to bring your numbers back up to the same average number of employees you had during that time. And then the salary for each of the employees that you have on staff needs to be at 75% or above compared to the prior quarter that they worked, which would be January 1st through March 31st. So what's a payroll expense? That's any amount paid to a W-2 employee, not a 1099 contractor. So an employee where the taxes are withheld from their paycheck. It's their salary, hourly wages, commissions, cash tips or equivalent, payment for leave, sick time, paid time off. Any of your normal payroll expenses are eligible for PPP use of funds. You can also continue to pay your group health care coverage and your retirement plans. The company side of state and local taxes, And then owner compensation replacement. The owner compensation replacement is a little bit different for those who have a Schedule C. That's based on line 31 net profit, and you multiply that by 8 and divide it by 52. That's your owner compensation replacement portion. It's a little bit different than when you pay yourself through W-2. So this is for the sole proprietors, the independent contractors, individuals that have 1099s that filed their Schedule C in order to get your PPP loan. What's not allowed is compensation in excess of $100,000 per year per employee. Those amounts were originally excluded when, or they should have been when you applied for your PPP loan. So over this 8-week period, you can't pay any of your W-2 employees more than $15,385. You can't provide compensation to any individual whose principal residence is outside of the United States. You can't make payments to any 1099 contractors. Those are the individuals that you just pay, one-off payments, or you give them a 1099 at the end of the year, and you don't withhold taxes from their paychecks. And then you cannot use the employer portions of Medicare, Social Security, or federal unemployment taxes. So the federal taxes, the employer portion, are not eligible uses. So some of the questions that have come up for us in past sessions or from borrowers, a big question is around, can you pay hazard pay or a bonus for your frontline workers? Guidance states that a decrease in wages of 25% will decrease the forgiven amount. And as long as the pay is not over $100,000 annually, then you should be able to do that hazard pay or bonus. And then the interim guidance that came out today, Tom, I know that you read it. Do you want to speak to this a little bit more about that guidance?
Sure. It came out and specifically said that hazard pay, those types of bonuses are allowable. However, as your slide says, Amber, it is still capped cash compensation to the annualized $100,000 annually.
Right. And just to clarify, the actual compensation can be the equivalent of 100,000, and then any health or retirement benefits are on top of that. That's not considered cash compensation. So those are two separate things. So you don't have to worry about health insurance or retirement bleeding over into the wages portion. So can a borrower pay employees even if there's not work, or move the employee to another position? This is along those same lines. The guidance does not prevent a borrower from paying employees to take an alternate position, a different type of position, working different hours. It just says that you cannot decrease their wages by more than 25% from the prior quarter. Can I use the PPP funds to cover a payroll in which workers have not yet received pay? So the way that the guidance reads is that the payroll can be paid on amounts earned or paid during the 8-week period. So we have two examples here. So if you had an employee that worked and your pay, they worked the prior 2 weeks, you got your PPP loan, and then you make the payment to them the next day, it's your normal payroll schedule, that is eligible for forgiveness even though they didn't earn the wages. And then also earned, so if you have, week 7, 8, you have employees that are working, but you haven't paid them yet, as long as you pay them on their normal regular schedule, even if it falls after your 8 weeks, you are eligible to use that for forgiveness. So you have a little bit of leeway with alternative payroll schedules there. And I don't know, Gina, if you want to speak to that a little bit more, or Tom, in terms of the alternate schedule or the way that paid versus earned. I know that was one of the questions that was asked in advance.
Yeah, sure. The alternate covered period only applies to payroll. The other items you'll cover are only the covered period, which starts day 1 is the day of dispersal. For payroll, however, it is either you can start on day 1 of dispersal, or if you have weekly and bi-weekly, you can start it with the first pay period that starts after the dispersal. So if you get the money on May 26th and your next pay period starts May 29th, you can start your 8 weeks May 29th for payroll.
So
And
I just want to clarify, Tom, it is the first payroll after that you get the funds. So you couldn't wait till the second or third payroll. If you are using that alternative payroll period, it has to be the first payroll starting of when your funds are dispersed.
Correct. And there's a similar rule when we get to non-payroll that it is, as Amber's saying, it's when it's incurred, but you do also have to pay it before the next billing cycle.
Yeah.
One thing I want to mention with that too is in the new interim final rule that just came out this morning, they do list a very good example on that optional pay period setup. So, and I posted the link to the main PPP page in the chat, and you can find those interim rules on those links that they provide. To if you want to go into more detail, but there's some good examples. So as you're reading through the forgiveness, it can walk you through it there as well.
And Amber, can I make one comment on the 25%?
Sure.
You will still be forgiven. The 25% rule isn't an all or nothing, but if your payroll declines more than 25%, you basically, well, it doesn't say penalties, you start to get into reductions beyond just how much you paid. So that's where that comes in. And the new interim final rule differentiates between FTE reductions and payroll reductions. It's frankly very complicated the way they've outlined it.
Not unlike most things involving this program. Another question we get a lot is back pay and eligible use of PPP funds. If I had employees that worked in the past, but I wasn't able to pay them, it is an eligible use of the funds. You are able to use the funds to make those back pay. However, it will likely not be forgiven because it wasn't earned or paid in that 8-week period on a normal schedule. What if an employee doesn't want to return to work, or if you need to let somebody go for cause? Interim final rule came out that if you make a good faith written offer to that employee and they reject the offer, you want to make sure you keep that documentation. It should not, will not impact your forgiveness. So for example, if you want to hire 3 of your employees back and they don't feel comfortable coming back because they just don't feel like it's safe, or perhaps they're immunocompromised, or if they say, I'm making a lot more on PUA, the unemployment assistance for the pandemic, you just want to keep that in writing. However, the employee should know that there's a potential that will impact their ability to continue to get unemployment. And then same thing, if you need to terminate an employee for cause, just make sure you're documenting it and make sure it's similar to how you've handled things in the past with your human resource policies. Just keep everything in writing. If you have somebody that won't respond back to you in writing because they don't want it on their record, what I've been recommending that people do is just send an email out saying that, based on our conversation, you've rejected my offer for employment and this will go into your employee file. And that should be sufficient for us as a lender that you've done your due diligence. Can I hire new or additional employees and be eligible for forgiveness? So yes, any new employee payroll earned or paid during the 8-week period is forgivable. A little caveat there is that if you're in the middle of expansion and your business is booming, then you probably don't actually need the PPP loan if you're able to make your regular payroll. So that's something that you want to consider. This PPP loan is for businesses that are experiencing an economic hardship. So if you're not experiencing an economic hardship, you might want to consider not taking the PPP loan. So how is the full-time employee calculation determined? This seems a little bit complicated, but really the SBA is considering a full-time employee somebody that works 40 hours. So what you'll want to do is look at all your employees that are at 40 hours, and then anybody else that works part-time, you can add up all of their hours and divide it by 40 to get your full-time employee count. A simplified method is that you can assign a 1 for anybody who's working 40 hours, and then if they work under 40 hours, then you can use a half, and then you add those up, and then that gives you your total count. So we're talking here a little bit about the other expenses eligible for forgiveness. So what's considered a rent or a lease payment? So us as a lender, we're looking at any amounts that are included in your lease agreement. So if you have your common area maintenance, your sales tax, if there's mandatory charges that are within your lease, say if it's for pest control, and they automatically include that in your lease payment, then we're considering that as a rent or lease payment. And then remember, it has to have been in effect prior to February 15th. And then another question a lot of people are asking about is, can a home office be considered for loan forgiveness? So yes, if you work from home or you've been working from home, then you're going to be able to prorate the space based on the amount that you're using, as long as you have a dedicated area in the home that you're only using for business. So for example, I'm in my office right now. The only thing that I use this office for is my work. So the things that are going to be eligible are the same that for everybody else. That's the portion of the mortgage interest, the utilities, and the rent. So you'll take the square footage of the area that you're using for office and you divide it by the total area of your home. So say, for example, my office is 100 square feet and my total home is 1,000 square feet. I know that I'm using 10% of my home for work purposes. So I can use 10% of my mortgage interest, my utilities, or my rent towards PPP, and it's forgivable. And you don't have to have claimed a home office deduction on your 2019 taxes in order to be eligible for this. So that's really nice that you didn't have to claim this in the past. But just remember that any expenses, whether it's payroll, whether it's your home office deduction, whether it's rent, utilities, these things cannot be used on your 2020 tax returns as expenses. Anything that you used and that was forgiven through PPP. So Gina, do you want to talk us through what is considered a utility and a little more about how the SBA is probably going to be looking at that? Oh, mute.
Myself. There you go. Sorry about that. So the things that are considered utilities are your water, your sewer, your electricity, telephone, including cell phone. Again, these all had to be in place before that February 15th day. Internet, gas, transportation. And what we're advising people in terms of this is just keep everything documented. You know, we are getting questions from a lot of people about working from home. So any emails or supporting documents that you can keep in regards to these things are going to be important as you move forward. And we're going to look at the documents that are required. We are just recommending that you create a file, that you keep all of these documents in there. You're going to need statements and those kinds of things. So Amber, I'll hand it back to you.
And jump in anytime if you want to speak to any of these items that we're about to talk about.
Do you want me to take this one?
Yeah, go for it.
So the following are not considered utilities. So janitorial, cleaning services, pest control, grease trap removal, HOA, association fees, insurance cost, IT services. For the person who had a question about transportation in the chat, what the current guidance says is that business vehicles for self-employed individuals or gas can be deducted for business vehicles for self-employed individuals. We're waiting for more specific guidance on this issue. I know that there's a lot of gray area here with some of these utilities, so I'm gonna just reference the start of this presentation when Tom said you just need to make really good decisions in running your business. You need to do what's right for your business and document this as you go through. And I think as long as you do that and what you're asking for is reasonable and customary, then I think, you know, you will be in a good place in terms of your business.
Great. Is my PPP loan forgiveness taxable through the IRS? So we talked about this in a previous slide. No, your loan forgiveness is not taxable, but remember that you're not able to use those expenses as a deduction on your tax return as well. So I'm recommending that you speak with your accountant, CPA, bookkeeper for a little bit more information on that. That's not a lender specific or forgiveness specific. It's how you're going to do your 2020 taxes. So you should start preparing for any kind of impact that that might have on your tax return. So when does the 8-week loan period start? That starts the date that the funds are deposited into your account, unless you're using the alternative period for your payroll, and that's just the payroll only. Can you use more than 75% on your payroll? Yes, you must use at least 75% for W-2 payroll. However, if you have W-2 employees, you can use 100% of it on that. The only caveat to that is if you are self-employed and you used your 2019 line 31 net income from your Schedule C, that portion, that 850 seconds, you can only use up to that amount. You can't use 100% for self-employment income. And then, am I required to have a separate bank account? So there's been a lot of organizations, ourselves included, that recommend that you have a separate bank account. If you have really good record keeping and you feel comfortable that you're able to fully document your expenses, then you don't have to. It's not a requirement. It's just a recommendation to keep things nice and clean and easy. And remember, you'll more than likely have to provide your bank statement. So if you want to keep it simple so that it's just PPP usage, then keep it in a separate account. Otherwise, you're going to have to share what's going on in your business with your lender and the SBA. So in terms of the EIDL advances, I think that this is one of the big areas that there's a lot of guidance that we really haven't received. I don't know, Gina or Tom, if you have any specific feedback on this, but the SBA should be deducting your EIDL advance amounts from the forgiveness amount. But it depends on when you got your EIDL, and we're talking about that $1,000 per employee advance or the grant that they gave. I don't know if either of you want to speak to this topic.
I can take it if you want. So, what we can say in terms of the PPP program is that the only constant is change. And I think that we all are learning to adapt in this ever-evolving environment. Tom and I have been on a couple of calls, I think Amber, you might have been too, where there's been hints that there may be some movement in terms of this area, but we haven't seen that yet. And so this is the most current and up-to-date guidance that we have at this point. But I would say, as with everything in this program, it's subject to change. We could see movement going forward. Do you want to add anything, Tom?
No, I would just say, as we said earlier, this is today's rule. Your forgiveness amount on your PPP will be reduced by the amount of EIDL advance you receive. The rule may change.
Great. So we talked before about employment benefits such as retirement or health insurance being a forgivable or usable portion. However, that's a little bit different for Schedule C filers because you probably have private personal insurance, or you might have your own IRA. Those aren't paid for by the business if you're self-employed most times, so those won't be eligible forgiveness amounts. So just a general idea of what you can expect in the forgiveness process. I know one of the questions we got in advance was about whether or not you would have to fill out the SBA forgiveness application, or if each lender would have a different process. From what I'm seeing right now, you will have to fill out that SBA application. The way we're doing it is online. So for our customers, they'll log into the original system that they provided all their documentation, and we'll ask all the different questions to get the application filled out. So we don't expect anybody to fill out the application. It's very cumbersome and it's pretty confusing, even for me, and I've been dealing with PPP this whole time. So we'll ask the questions and it'll automatically fill it out and populate it. And I suspect that there will be quite a few lenders that will do it the same way. Maybe not the larger banks, they might just expect it. I don't really know what to expect in terms of other lenders. So I would reach out to your lender to ask them what their process is going to be like. But somewhere around the 7th week, you'll be asked to start filling that out and providing documentation. And once you determine what your forgivable amount is going to be, if there's a portion of your PPP loan that's not going to be forgivable, then you're going to have two options. One is that you can just pay it back then and there, or the other option is that it's going to turn into a 2-year term at 1%, and there will be a 6-month deferral period, so you won't make payments for the first 6 months. So really you only make 18 months of payments. However, remember that the funds, even if they're not forgivable, they are still restricted to the eligible uses of payroll, mortgage interest, rent, utilities, and interest on other debts. So you can't use them for other things. I know that we've seen some things in the news recently with buying Rolexes or, you know, a new fancy car. That's not an eligible use. And Gina, Tom, and I were all on a call with the Inspector General about how they're really cracking down. I've said in previous webinars, you know, don't go posting online about, hey, I got this free money from the government, or I got my PPP loan, and ha ha ha, the government didn't know I didn't really need it, so I went out and bought X, Y, and Z. Remember that everything you put on the internet is public knowledge, and the SBA will be looking at that. The Inspector General will be looking at that if you are misusing your funds. Tom, did you have something to add?
I was just going to highlight the one thing you've shown here in parentheses. A lot of people don't hear about interest on other debt that existed before February 15th is an allowable use. It's not a forgivable use, but it is an allowable use. I just want to make sure we highlighted that, because we usually don't talk about that.
Yeah, so we're talking about if they have like another SBA loan or some other kind of term loan, then the interest portion. I don't know if I've seen it definitively, but I don't think that covers credit card, because that's a revolving line as opposed to a fixed. Do you have any feedback on that?
I think it's only fixed debt. I've not heard anything about revolving debt.
Okay, yeah, so not for credit card debt, but if you have another term loan, or if you have lease payments or term payments on large equipment, then that would be an eligible use of that interest, but just remember, not forgivable. So Gina's going to walk us through the types of documentation that you want to keep, and maybe speak to how you want to keep it, maybe some suggestions for keeping everything nice and tidy so you're ready to make your application for forgiveness around that 7-week mark.
Yes, I'd love to. So as we talked about a little bit earlier in the presentation, you know, these loans are going to be scrutinized. The Inspector General is looking at these loans, especially when you get into those larger loan amounts. There's going to be some great review going on about these. I do endorse the idea of keeping the separate bank account. It's just a real clean way for you to track your money and keep it clean. But what you can be doing during this time period is really preparing yourself to go for loan forgiveness. And that's difficult, because I know that sometimes the questions that you have still aren't answered. But I've seen some questions in the chat. Well, do I follow earlier guidance? You know, what do I do? We talked a little bit about documenting earlier in terms of emails, you know, any types of those things. The SBA didn't create this program to have a gotcha experience. This really was to have businesses be successful and retain employees. So as long as you're doing what you can to run your business effectively and documenting this and making a clean proposal, you're doing the right thing. Now, these are the things that you're going to need for sure. And those are the copies of your bank statements for the 8-week period that the PPP loan is used, payroll reports. So what are we talking about when we mean payroll reports? Those are going to be your 941, your unemployment, your state reports. You're going to need your payroll reports for the covered 8-week period, and then also the reference period. You will need employee pay stubs, copies of invoices and checks. This is to show that you've paid group health or your lease payments. I did see a question in the chat about someone who had started a new lease that didn't have it last year. Just maybe a lease agreement would be a great reference point for you. You are going to need a copy of your 2019 Schedule C, copies of your lease and utility contracts, and then any written documentation of employees that refuse to return to work. If there's anything outside of these parameters of these reference documents, like I said, I would just suggest you document this information. If you have questions and you need support moving forward in preparing yourself for loan forgiveness, your local SBDC centers are a great community partner that you can lean on. They can help you prepare this packet and get you ready to go through this process with your lender. So I'm gonna put the link in the chat for the Arizona SBDC, where you can find an SBDC in your county close to you.
Hey, Gina.
Yeah.
Just to add that the application, while the application is very complicated, does have a complete list of all documentation. Something else that's really important for everybody to know. You have to maintain copies of everything from application through all the documentation for 6 years. That's 6 years after the later of your forgiveness date or the date the loan is repaid in full. So whatever the later date of those two is, you have to retain all of this documentation for 6 years.
And Tom, moving forward on those things, thanks for catching that for me. I would recommend you keep both paper copies and digital. For those of you who have larger PPP loan amounts, this is a great deal of money. So keep really clean, accurate records. When these loans start going to the SBA for approval, they are going to be checking to verify that the 941s and the information that you're submitting do match what you've submitted to the regulatory authorities. So keep clean records, make sure they're accurate, make sure they match what you're submitting, so that you can navigate this process as simply as possible.
Are we ready to take questions, Amber?
Yeah, I think so. This is the end of the that portion of the presentation, and I just want to make a comment that as the lender, and I think Gina, mentioned this isn't a gotcha, and really we're looking at what's usual and customary for your business, and are you being consistent with that? Are you doing things outside of the scope of what you normally do? And I know that's a funny thing to say right now because everything's completely turned upside down because of COVID, but in the past, how did you pay people? How did you pay your bills? What was normal? Did you give bonuses, or is this a brand new thing that you're just deciding to do? So what's customary, what's normal, and have documentation on that.
Before we jump into questions, one thing I want to kind of reiterate, and I saw something in the chat as well about this, is that the forgiveness is through your bank who gave you the loan. It's not through the SBA, so you can fill all the paperwork, but if you send it to the SBA, it's not going to get to your bank. So you have to go through your bank. And I know in the chat that someone mentioned, Bobby Evans mentioned that, said if you receive a PPP loan from Wells Fargo, they already have PPP forgiveness worksheets and application when you log in online. And she's already been filling out the worksheets to keep her on track. So many banks have probably already started setting this up, so you want to check with your bank and see where you're at with that. But again, it is through the bank in which you got the loan from, and nobody else.
Bob, can I expand on that? So yes, you do need to go through your lender to begin the forgiveness application process, and that's how you'll navigate this. But I also want to just highlight that the SBA has given you a long time to search or to apply for loan forgiveness. And so, this isn't a rush program. This isn't a got you kind of experience. And so take your time with it. New guidance is coming out all of the time. We received some this morning that was extremely favorable. And so, really take your time. You utilize that time for loan forgiveness. You don't have a payment due right now. And so my very avid recommendation is that you take this time, that you ensure your documents are filled out correctly, and that you're doing the best thing for you. You may have new guidance that comes out after your loan's forgiven, or a portion of your loan's forgiven, that's made it even more favorable for you. So right now, in terms of this loan, time is your friend. And so use that time.
I don't know what your conditions are, so I'll leave it for.
Thank you, Gina. So let's jump into some of these Q&As, and we got a lot of questions in here. So we'll start at towards the top. Do part-time employees need to be returned to headcount as well in order to be eligible for forgiveness?
That's going to be based on the full-time equivalent. So you want to add all of your part-time employees up to the 10th of the hour. So you would take, if they work 30 hours, so you would divide 30 by 40 to get their, 0.7 or 0.8 if you want to round up. So they're a 0.8 full-time employee. And you can add up all of those, point to the 10th and add them all up to get what your head count needs to be in the full-time equivalent.
Yeah, I mean, keep in mind, the borrower selects which way they want to count FTE, the simple or the 10th rule. You get forgiveness even if they don't, but your forgiveness is reduced if they don't. So it's not an all or nothing scenario.
Another question, what if an employee retires during 8 weeks of PPP loan? In January, they let us know that they had planned to retire end of May. Do we have to replace them to keep headcount?
I've seen a couple questions that are kind of in this vein around what if someone voluntarily wants to leave or reduce their hours, or they retire, or they decide to leave. And all of those, as long as you keep proper documentation, it's under the safe harbor that it doesn't impact your forgiveness. So if you have somebody that worked part of the time and then they leave on their own, volition, or they want to go down to part-time, then that won't impact your forgiveness as long as you have the documentation there.
I have a full-time employee that requested to reduce their hours to part-time. As long as the total compensation paid to him is still above 75% of what they were making full-time, we are okay for safe harbor, question mark.
Robert, that's what Amber was just referring to. All of these voluntary things, you don't get penalized, but you still only get forgiven what you paid.
What about if payroll is semi-monthly? I received PPP funds on 5/4/2020. My next payroll was on 5/15. Can I start the 8-week period on 5/16?
Yes.
I pay twice a month.
Yes, that's acceptable.
And again, I think you want to make sure you're documenting everything on your pay periods, again, with that, to make sure you can show the 8 weeks of that. And again, you're doing twice a month, but it's in 8 weeks, 56 days. So you have to make sure you're paying it properly in that. I know we answered this, but it's probably good to talk about again. The PPP forgiveness application, does it need to be done before the 8 weeks?
No.
I would recommend not. Again, time is your friend. Take the time, use the length of your forgiveness window, and see, really create yourself a great story to ensure that you get as much forgiveness as possible.
Another question, I have a question regarding the earned hours. We pay bonuses on a quarterly basis. Will bonuses earned be included in the forgiven payroll?
Yeah, that's
as long as it doesn't exceed the $15,385
right
during your 8-week period.
There's another one. S Corp shareholders work in a home office and has an accountable for home office reimbursement. Are the utilities and mortgage interest eligible for PPP forgiveness?
As long as the space is a dedicated workspace, then you'll take the portion and divide that square footage by the home's total square footage to get the percentage of your home office space. And then you can use that percentage towards utilities, mortgage interest, or rent. Yes.
Like a similar one to that, but asked about the documentation. I rent space to my company. I have no lease agreement, but we do show a history of canceled rent checks dating back over 10 years at the same amount. Will this documentation suffice?
You know, that's going to be a difficult question to answer. I can, from an accounting perspective, I can say that, you know, what you've been doing is customary, it's reasonable. But in terms of loan forgiveness, I don't know if they're going to ask for more documentation in terms of that. I would maybe write a statement explaining what the situation has been, include a year's worth of copied checks or whatever. But that one's going to need a little bit more exploration.
Yeah, I agree, Gina.
Do business owners count for full-time employees?
If you're on W-2 payroll, I don't see why not.
Question about using 25% for rent expense. What if our rent space has downsized and thus we needed to sign a new lease agreement in June? Can we be forgiven for any of the new rent payments that are now on the new lease? They're less than the past rent payments, or do we now miss out on using the rent expenses with the forgiveness money?
So it's going to be the rent for the covered 56 days or 8-week period. And so whatever your rent is during the period that you're using your loan would be counted for that 25%, as part of that 25%.
Now, I think on that one, they were mentioning that, I know an earlier slide said that it had to be your lease that was in place as of February 15th, I believe, or March 15th. So if they had to sign a new lease, sounds like after that.
Because they had an existing lease and then they made a change to it that it would be eligible. I think that that issue stems from brand new businesses that are just now, you know, in May you decide to sign a lease. So I think that that would be, okay.
Had a couple questions on the transportation thing again. So this one says, can you please give an example of transportation as it relates to utilities?
I think as Gina said, the only thing we have some confidence in right now is fuel for a business-owned vehicle. And we've seen a lot of guidance that set maybe only for self-employed, but I've seen other recent comments that it's any business-owned vehicle. So that's we need more guidance question, and we'll let everybody know.
Yeah, the rule just says transportation and there's zero clarification on that.
And in terms of these things that need clarification, you know, again, I think that we're going to see that coming out in the next couple days, weeks. I think that as this program expands and people are going through this, I think the answered questions will just increase and we'll have more of that information.
Another question, if insurance is called out in lease as CAM and billed monthly as part of CAM, can it be included?
So we're looking at anything that's a part of your lease agreement as being a lease or rent expense. So if as part of your CAM, which is in your lease, they include the insurance, then I would say that that is covered.
I would agree.
So is your ISP services and office tech support, is that allowable?
ISP is, office tech support is not.
Is the idle grant deducted from the total PPP? Would the 75-25 then be calculated from the reduced amounts?
the EIDL grant is reduced from the forgiveness amount, not from the total PPP. And just to clarify, we keep talking about 75-25. Remember, 75 is the minimum for payroll. If your payroll is 90, then you have up to 10 to spend on the other. So it's not a fixed 75-25.
So as a 1099 sole proprietor, I asked for minimum loan. Funds were dispersed, so can I use only 75%?
You can use 8/52 of your net income. So what you would do is take the Schedule C, line 31, multiply it by 8 and divide it by 52, and then that's your eligible owner compensation replacement. The remaining amount you can use for eligible expenses and have those forgiven as well, but you as a self-employed individual cannot use 100% for owner compensation. And again, to Tom's point, if you don't have those types of expenses, if you are, an independent contractor and you don't have a home office, you don't have any kind of office, that other portion isn't forgivable. You can still use it for eligible expenses, or you can pay it back to your lender, or it'll turn into the term loan.
All right, we got another one here. If regarding EIDL tied to PPP, if received both EIDL advance, example 10,000, and PPP loan, the 10,000 will be reduced by PPP forgiveness. However, you can still keep the EIDL monies as a loan and plan to pay back based on terms, correct?
I think what they're asking, yes, the EIDL advance reduces the PPP forgiveness. The EIDL advance is an advance, so it's not a loan. It will never be paid back. If you have a separate EIDL loan, yes, that EIDL loan is paid back at normal terms.
All right, well, we're wrapping up. We have a lot of questions, and we're going to print off all these questions and answer them and post some FAQs on the website with them. And with all the questions we have, there's a very high probability of doing another PPP session to get through the questions and give updates on any interim final rules that may come down in the future. But with the last couple of minutes, I'd just like to go through the panel and ask Amber, Gina, and Tom to just share the last final thoughts as we wrap up. And so, Amber?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the big thing to take away is really just stick to what's usual and customary for your business, what you've been doing, and really focus on the documentation portion of it. In calls with the SBA, they really talk about, what was the state of mind when you made the decision that you made? Was there stuff on the news going on? Did your lender tell you something? And also work with your lender, ask them the questions that you have, because ultimately the lender is going to determine your forgivable amount. That's their responsibility. So have a great relationship with your lender if it's possible. I know it's not always possible with the larger banks, but ask those questions and just stick to what's usual and customary for your business.
Gina?
I agree with everything that Amber said. Additionally, I would just like to advise you to lean on your local resources. The small business development centers in your counties are an excellent resource to help you navigate this process. I put the link up for the Arizona Small Business Development Center network where you can find your local office. The SBDCs are great partners of the ACA, and we have experts in every office to help navigate this process for you. So you don't have to do this alone, and you can get help, free help in your own areas.
All right, Tom.
All I would add, Robert, is I agree with everything Amber and Gina have said. You've taken the first step, just being here. Getting help is always a great idea, but really it's mindset. Don't panic. It's not a big deal. You get as much forgiven as you get forgiven. Anything left over is a 1% 2-year loan that you only have to pay off over 18 months. So, it's all, in that sense, it's good news. For the self-employed, for partnerships, or a lot of unique rules and situations, make sure you talk with your CPA and your banks and your advisors. And for HR, do make sure if necessary you get legal advice. There may be ADA rules that come into play, or NLRB rules. So a lot of moving parts, but there's a lot of help and a lot of resources for you.
All right, well, we want to thank Amber, Gina, and Tom for their participation in today's panel and presentation about PPP. There's lots of questions, and they're here to support, and your banks are there to support you as well, as they're wanting you to get the forgiveness, so please reach out to them. So we appreciate everybody spending time with us, and we look forward to you visiting with us tomorrow on Wednesday's boot camp. But again, thank you to Amber, Gina, and Tom, and everybody have a great day. I will leave the windows open for another few minutes so you can post any other additional questions you may have so we can answer them. And if you have any other topics you'd like to hear on our boot camps, please post those in the chat as well. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.